January 3, 1943. 4 miles above German-occupied France. Staff Sergeant Alan McGee is trapped inside a metal sphere hanging beneath a burning B-17 bomber. Flames are licking through the fuselage. The temperature inside the ball turret is dropping below zero as freezing air screams through shredded aluminum, and Alan McGee is about to make a decision that defies every instinct of self-preservation. He's going to jump without a parachute. What happens next shouldn't be possible. According to physics, according to medicine, according to every law of survival, Alan McGee should not exist beyond the next 4 minutes. But he does. And the reason why involves a German train station, a glass roof, and a confluence of circumstances so improbable that it would reshape our understanding of human survival for the next 80 years. This is the story of the man who fell from the sky and lived to tell about it. But before we understand how a 24-year-old ball turret gunner survived a 22,000-foot plunge at terminal velocity, we need to go back to where it all began, to a position so dangerous that gunners faced a 60% mortality rate. To a target so heavily defended it was known by a single, ominous nickname, Flak City. In the winter of 1943, the air war over Europe had reached a brutal stalemate. The United States Army Air Forces were attempting something unprecedented: daylight precision bombing deep into Nazi-occupied territory. Unlike the British, who bombed at night under cover of darkness, American crews flew in broad daylight. Attempting to hit specific military targets with Norden bomb sites, the strategy looked brilliant on paper. In practice, it was a meat grinder. The 303rd Bomb Group, known as Hell's Angels, operated out of Molesworth Airfield in Cambridgeshire, England. Their aircraft of choice was the B-17 Flying Fortressa 4-engine heavy bomber that carried the hopes of the entire Allied strategic bombing campaign. Each fortress required a crew of 10 men: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, flight engineer, radio operator, and for gunners, positioned throughout the aircraft. Alan Eugene McGee was one of those gunners. Born January 13, 1919, in Plainfield, New Jersey, he'd enlisted in the Army Air Corps after Pearl Harbor, joining millions of young Americans rushing to defend their country. But McGee had a particular disadvantage that became his greatest asset. He was short and thin, perfect dimensions for a ball turret gunner. The Sperry ball turret was perhaps the most terrifying innovation in aviation history, a rotating sphere of plexiglass and steel that hung beneath the belly of the B-17. Suspended in space with nothing but clouds and earth visible in every direction, the gunner had to fold himself into a fetal position, knees pulled to his chest, operating 2.50 caliber machine guns that could traverse 360 degrees. The space was so cramped that gunners couldn't wear their parachutes inside. They had to leave them in the fuselage, accessible only if they could climb back up through the entrance hatch. You operated in that position for 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours during a mission. You watched enemy fighters approach from below, their wings sparkling with cannon fire. You felt every burst of flak shake the aircraft like a giant's fist, and you did it knowing that if the hydraulics failed during landing, the turret might not retract, trapping you in a sphere that would be crushed flat when the belly touched the runway. Despite these horrors, statistics would later reveal something surprising. The ball turret actually had one of the lower casualty rates among crew positions. The waist gunners, standing exposed on either side of the fuselage, suffered the highest losses. But 60% mortality, the figure often cited for ball turret gunners, was still a coin flip, weighted toward death. By January 1943, Alan McGee had completed 6 missions. Each one added weight to the odds against him. The statistical reality was brutal. In the first years of the air campaign, the chance of completing a full tour of 25 missions was less than 25%. Most crews didn't make it past their 10th sortie. His 7th mission would target a place that haunted the nightmares of every bomber crew in England, Saint-Nazaire. The French port city sat on the Atlantic coast at the mouth of the Loire River. Before the war, it had been a thriving shipbuilding center. By 1943, the Germans had transformed it into one of the most heavily fortified locations in occupied Europe. Home to massive concrete submarine pens that housed the abodus strangely Allied supply lines. The British Royal Air Force had already given Saint-Nazaire a nickname that said everything you needed to know: Flak City. The Germans had ringed the submarine pens with concentrated anti-aircraft batteries, more than 200 guns of various calibers, from 20mm automatic cannons to massive 88mm and 105mm heavy flak pieces. These weren't scattered defenses, they were positioned in overlapping fields of fire, creating a box of exploding steel that any approaching bomber had to fly through. The submarine pens themselves were architectural monsters. Walls 11 feet thick, roofs 16 feet of reinforced concrete, Conventional bombs bounced off like pebbles, but the Allies kept trying. They had to. German U-boats were sinking 100,000 tons of Allied shipping every month. If the submarine campaign wasn't stopped, Britain would starve and the invasion of Europe would become impossible. On January 3, 1943, the 303rd Bomb Group was assigned to hit the torpedo storage areas near those submarine pens. It was their 9th mission as a group, and their 5th attack on St. Nazaire. Every crew knew what that meant. Alan McGee climbed into his ball turret that morning aboard B-17F, serial number 4124620. A bomber with a name as cheerful as its mission was grim. Snap, crackle, pop. The aircraft had been christened by Captain Jacob Fredericks, who'd worked for Kellogg Company before the war makers of Rice Krispies cereal and its famous advertising slogan. In the grim calculus of bomber operations, a playful name was psychological armor against the reality of what you were about to do. McGee didn't know it yet, but he was about to become part of aviation history. Not for anything he would accomplish, but for what he would survive. The mission briefing that morning carried the weight of previous failures. St. Nazaire had chewed up and spit out dozens of Allied bombers. Crews sat in the briefing room with the numb resignation of men who'd seen too many empty bunks, too many personal effects packed up and sent home. The 303rd would be part of a larger force, multiple bomb groups flying in formation, a strategy called Combat Box designed to mass defensive firepower. Each B-17 carried 13.50 caliber machine guns. In formation, that firepower multiplied into overlapping fields that could theoretically protect against fighter attacks. Theoretically. Snap, crackle, pop. Lifted off from Molesworth, McGee crawled through the fuselage and lowered himself into the ball turret. The mechanical whir of the entry hatch closing above him was always unsettling, the sound of being sealed into a glass coffin. He connected his oxygen mask, checked the intercom, and rotated the turret through its full range of motion. The English Channel passed beneath him, gray and cold. Its surface stippled with WHITECAPS. That's the formation crossed into occupied France. Below, the patchwork countryside looked deceptively peaceful, farmers' fields and villages, connected by narrow roads. But McGee knew better. Every square mile down there was under Nazi control. If you went down, your war was over. Best case, you became a prisoner. Worst case, well, plenty of downed airmen never made it to POW camps. The intercom crackled with position reports. The formation tightened up as they approached the initial pointed geographical marker where the bomb run would begin. From here, the bomber would fly straight and level for several minutes, giving the bombardier time to line up the Norden bombsight. No evasive maneuvers. No matter what happened, you held course until the bombs dropped. It was the most vulnerable phase of any mission. Then, they entered the flak. Anyone who's never experienced concentrated anti-aircraft fire cannot truly understand its psychological horror. The shells burst in patterns, black puffs of smoke appearing in seconds, each one marking an explosion that sent thousands of steel fragments screaming in all directions. The sound inside the aircraft was deafening, a continuous hammering, like being inside a drum during a violent thunderstorm. Shrapnel punched through aluminum with a sound like rocks hitting a tin roof. But flak was predictable. The real terror came when German fighters appeared. Messerschmitt, Bf-189s, and Wolf 190s. Single-engine Predators designed for one purpose, killing bombers. They came in fast, wings sparkling with 20mm cannon fire, then broke away before the defensive gunners could draw a bead. Some attacked from the front, knowing the B-17's nose was relatively lightly defended. Others dove from above or rose from below, targeting the engines or the vulnerable belly. Alan McGee's domain. From his rotating sphere, McGee tracked targets that appeared as small crosses growing rapidly larger. He led them with his twin 50s. Short, controlled bursts, the guns hammering against his chest. Spent shell casings ejected into the turret, piling up around his feet, the smell of cordite mixed with hydraulic fluid and engine oil. Then the hit came. The exact sequence varies depending on which account you read, but the result was catastrophic. Snap, crackle, pop. Took multiple direct hits. Some sources say it was flak. Others report fighter cannon fire. What's certain is that the bomber was mortally wounded, engines failing, fuel lines severed, fire spreading through the fuselage. In the ball turret, Alan McGee felt the aircraft lurch violently. The intercom went dead. Through the plexiglass, he saw one of the engines trailing black smoke. He tried rotating the turret to see more, but the hydraulic system was failing. The turret responding sluggishly. He needed to get out. Now, operating the hand crank, he rotated the turret until the entry hatch aligned with the opening in the fuselage floor. He unlocked the hatch and pushed upward, climbing back into the bomber's belly. What he found was held-out fire, smoke so thick he could barely see. The oxygen system was compromised, making every breath a struggle. The aircraft was in a dying spiral, centrifugal force pushing him toward the outer skin. He could hear the screaming of wind through torn metal, could feel the temperature dropping as freezing air at 20,000 feet poured through dozens of holes, and he could see crew members trying to bail out. Standard procedure was clear. If the aircraft was going down, you grabbed your parachute, clipped it to your harness, and jumped. The parachute would open after a short delay, slowing your fall to a survivable 15 to 20 feet per second. It was the difference between life and death, but Alan McGee couldn't find his parachute, in the chaos. With smoke filling the fuselage and the bomber spinning, the chute was nowhere to be seen. Some accounts suggest it had been damaged by the same fire that crippled the aircraft. Others theorized it had been stored in a different location, and the crew rotation confused things. One version claims McGee was blown out of the aircraft before he could retrieve it. What we know for certain is this. At some point between 20,000 and 22,000 feet above St. Nazaire, Alan McGee found himself falling through open air without a parachute. Did you know that a human body in free fall reaches terminal velocity, the maximum speed at which air resistance equals gravitational acceleration, after about 1,500 feet? That takes roughly 12 seconds. After that, you're falling at approximately 120 miles per hour in a belly-down position, or up to 200 miles per hour if you're tumbling or falling, headfirst. Alan McGee. He had more than 4 miles to contemplate this, according to his later testimony. He remained conscious for the first part of the fall. He knew what was happening. He understood that, in approximately 90 seconds, he would hit the ground at a speed that would instantly liquefy every organ in his body, shatter every bone into fragments, essentially turn him into a bag of destroyed tissue. In those moments, he prayed. The accounts quote him as saying, "I don't wish to die because I know nothing of life." Then, somewhere around 10,000 feet, the lack of oxygen caused him to black out. He fell unconscious through 4 miles of freezing winter sky above German-occupied France, tumbling at terminal velocity, while below him the city of St. grew larger and larger. Approximately 0800 hours. Staff Sergeant Alan Eugene McGee crashed through the glass roof of the St. Nazaire railroad station. He should have died on impact. Every calculation of physics said so. Terminal velocity for a human body is approximately 120 miles per hour. That's 176 feet per second. The human body can survive impacts up to about 20 feet per second under ideal conditions, carefully controlled fall onto forgiving ground. At 120 miles per hour, hitting a concrete surface generates the same force as being hit by a car at highway speed. Organs rupture from deceleration. The heart tears loose from its major vessels. The brain slams against the skull. Bones don't just break, they shatter into splinters. But the St. Nazaire train station had a glass roof. Not just any glass. This was reinforced with steel framework designed to let light into the passenger platforms below. When Alan McGee's body struck that roof, several things happened in rapid sequence. The glass shattered, obviously, but not all at once. His body crashed through panel after panel, each one absorbing a fraction of his kinetic energy. The steel framework bent and twisted, further dissipating force. And most importantly, the roof was angled not flat, but pitched at approximately 30 degrees. Instead of a direct vertical impact, McGee's body glanced off surfaces, converting some of his downward velocity into lateral motion. He tumbled through the breaking glass, slid along steel girders, bounced off support beams. Each impact was catastrophic in isolation, but collectively they did something miraculous. They slowed him down. By the time he hit the stone floor of the platform below, his velocity had been reduced from 120 miles per hour to perhaps 40 or 50 miles per hour. Still, fatal for most people, still a speed that should have killed him, but somehow, Alan McGee survived. German soldiers stationed at the train station reached him first. They found a broken, bleeding American airman lying amid shattered glass and twisted metal. Unconscious, but somehow, impossibly, still breathing. Here's where the story takes another remarkable turn. The Germans could have left him to die. He was an enemy combatant, part of a bombing campaign that was killing German civilians. In the hardened calculus of total war, an American bomber crew member's life held no particular value. But the Germans called for a doctor. The military physician who arrived at the scene, his name lost to history, took one look at Alan McGee and made a decision that honored the Hippocratic Oath over the hatred of war. As McGee would later recount, "I owe the German military doctor who treated me a debt of gratitude. He told me, 'We are enemies, but I am first a doctor, and I will do my best to save your arm.'" The doctor's assessment revealed the full scope of McGee's injuries. He had suffered 28 shrapnel wounds from the fighter attack before the Thalia crushed right leg and Fuda badly cut right arm. with severe muscle and tissue damage, severe damage to his right eye, broken nose, damage to his kidneys and liver from the impacts, multiple lacerations across his entire body, internal bleeding from organs that had been thrown against his ribcage. Be any medical standard, he should have died from internal injuries alone. The trauma to his organs should have caused catastrophic hemorrhaging. The leg injuries should have led to fatal blood loss or infection. The shrapnel wounds, untreated during the fall, should have caused septic shock. But he didn't die. The German doctor worked for hours, stabilizing McGee, treating the most life-threatening injuries first. The most critical was the right arm, so badly damaged that amputation seemed inevitable. But the doctor refused to give up. He meticulously repaired torn muscles, reconnected damaged blood vessels, and somehow managed to save the limb. McGee regained consciousness in a German first aid station. The pain was indescribably nerve-ending, screaming, every breath in agony as broken ribs shifted. But he was conscious. He was thinking. He was alive. German officers came to interview him. They wanted to know how he'd survived. Was this some new American survival technique? Special equipment? Had he been wearing some kind of protective gear? When McGee told them the truth, that his parachute had been inaccessible, that he'd fallen for miles and crashed through a glass roof. Didn't believe him at first. It was too improbable, too impossible. But the evidence was undeniable. The shattered glass roof, the pattern of injuries, the accounts from witnesses who'd seen a body falling from the sky. Slowly, the Germans realized they were looking at something unprecedented. A man who had survived terminal velocity impact through the most unlikely combination of circumstances imaginable. McGee was transferred to a German military hospital, where he spent weeks recovering. Then came transport to Stalag 17B, a prisoner of war camp in Braunau, Austria, the same camp that would later be made famous by the film Stalag 17. His war was over, but he was alive. Meanwhile, back at Molesworth Airfield, the 303rd Bomb Group was conducting a grim accounting. Snap, crackle, pop was listed as missing in action. Of the 10 crew members, only 3 survived. Alan McGee, Lieutenant Glenn Harrington, the navigator, who'd lost his leg but managed to bail out and land successfully, and Staff Sergeant J.I. Gordon, another crew member who parachuted to safety. 7 men died in the crash. The mission had been costly for the entire group. 4 B-17s lost. 40 men killed or missing, and the submarine pens barely scratched. Those massive concrete structures would survive dozens more bombing raids before finally being abandoned by the Germans in 1944. For Alan McGee, the war became a waiting game. Prison camp life was harsh and inadequate. Food, brutal winters, the constant psychological pressure of captivity. His injuries continued to plague him. The right arm, though saved, would never fully recover. His eye damage left him with permanent vision problems. The leg healed badly, leaving him with a pronounced limp. But in May 1985, as Allied forces swept through Germany, Stalag 17B was liberated. American troops freed the prisoners. And Alan McGee returned home to a country that had moved on from individual stories of survival. There were millions of such stories. Everyone knew someone who'd done something incredible during the war. McGee didn't seek publicity. He received the Air Medal for meritorious conduct and the Purple Heart for injuries sustained in combat. But he rarely spoke about his experience. He worked in the airline industry, an ironic choice, perhaps for someone who'd survived such a horrific fall and lived a quiet life. He married Helen, retired in 1979, and eventually moved to northern New Mexico. For decades, his story remained largely unknown, outside a small circle of military historians and 303rd Bomb Group veterans. But in the 1990s, something remarkable happened. The French citizens of Saint-Nazaire decided to honor the crew of Snap, Crackle, Pop with a memorial. They researched the crash, tracked down the location in the forest at La Balle Iscabluc where the bomber had gone down, and located the sole survivor, Alan McGee. On September 23, 1995, 52 years after the crash, Alan and Helen McGee returned to France. Michel Luges, president of the American Memorial Association, greeted them at Nantes-Atlantique Airport and escorted them throughout the commemoration. After a mass for the 7 fallen crewmen, the entourage proceeded to the crash site in the forest. There, a memorial was unveiled, a plaque naming each crew member who had died. Alan McGee planted a tree. They called it a tree of peace. The next day, he visited the U.S. military cemetery at St. James in Normandy, where 5 of his crew members were buried. Lieutenant Glenn Wintersetter, Technical Sergeant Dennis Hart, Technical Sergeant A.M. Union, Sergeant M.L. Mayam, and Staff Sergeant E.W. Durant. He paid his respects at each grave, spending long minutes in silent contemplation. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The return to the train station. The building had been rebuilt after the war, but the basic structure remained, including the glass roof. French historians had documented exactly where McGee had crashed through, marking the spot with photographs and measurements. Alan McGee stood on the platform, looking up at the glass panels overhead. Reporters surrounded him, asking for his thoughts, his memories. His response was simple and profound. "I thought it was much smaller." The man who had never actually seen the building, who had been unconscious when he hit it, who had experienced it only as the thing that saved his life, was finally confronting the physical reality of his survival. The glass roof looked ordinary, functional, not particularly special, yet it had absorbed an impact that should have been instantly fatal. Had dissipated kinetic energy through fracture mechanics and glancing angles, had slowed a human body from 120 miles per hour to survivable speed, through nothing more than the breaking point of silicon dioxide and the bending of steel. A reporter asked him what he remembered of the fall. McGee's answer revealed the strange mathematics of survival. "I asked God to save my life because I knew nothing of life. Then I blacked out. The next thing I knew, I was in a German first aid station." Between those two moments, the prayer and the awakening lay for miles of falling, a catastrophic impact, and the narrowest possible margin between existence and oblivion. After his return from France, Alan McGee lived for another 8 years. He and Helen settled in San Angelo, Texas, enjoying the quiet retirement that had eluded so many of his generation. The war remained with him in the limp, in the scarred arm, in the eye damage that affected his vision, but he had outlived the moment that should have killed him by more than half a century. On December 20, 2003, Staff Sergeant Alan Eugene McGee died in the San Angelo hospital. He was 84 years old. His body was cremated, and his remains were buried in Pioneer Memorial Park in Grape Creek, Texas. The death notice was short and simple. No services would be held. In the grand sweep of World War II history, Alan McGee's story occupies a footnote. He didn't lead armies, didn't make strategic decisions, didn't shape the outcome of the war. The mission that nearly killed him accomplished almost nothing. The submarine pens continued operating for another year. 7 of his crewmates died. Thousands of other American airmen would follow them before the war ended, but his survival entered the record books. In 1981, Smithsonian Magazine featured him in an article about the 10 most amazing survival stories of World War II. Researchia studied his case, trying to understand the physics of what had occurred. The Mythbusters television show even tested various theories about his survival in their 4th season, though they gave most of them a busted rating, acknowledging that while they couldn't replicate the exact conditions, the core event had indeed occurred. The crew of Snap, Crackle, Pop lives on in memory. The memorial in France remains a quiet marker in a forest where young men died far from home. Fragments of the B-17's fuselage survived the war as well, including the section with the bomber's cheerful name. Cut away by German troops as a trophy, recovered after liberation by Michel Herret from the rocks near Saint-Marc-sur-Mer, that section of aluminum, bearing the painted words, Snap, Crackle, Pop, sits in a French museum today, a relic of industrial warfare and human resilience. Ellen's navigator, Lieutenant Glenn Harrington, survived as a POW, despite losing his leg. He was one of the first Army Air Forces men to be repatriated due to his injuries. He died in 1987. Staff Sergeant J.I. Gordon, the third survivor, vanished into the anonymity that claimed so many veterans' post-war fate, unknown to military historians. The 303rd Bomb Group Hells Angels completed 364 combat missions during the war, more than any other American bomb group. They lost 165 aircraft in combat, with 773 men killed or missing in action. Their survival rate gradually improved as the war progressed, as tactics evolved, as fighter escorts extended deeper into Germany, as the Luftwaffe ran out of fuel and experienced pilots. But in January 1943, during the mission to Saint Nazaire, victory seemed distant and uncertain. The strategic bombing campaign appeared to be failing. Losses were catastrophic. Targets remained operational, and American crews were dying at rates that couldn't be sustained. Yet they kept flying. Men like Alan McGee kept climbing into ball turrets and waist, guns and tail positions, kept manning bombers with cheerful names, kept pushing through flak-filled skies, toward targets that seemed indestructible. The Saint Nazaire submarine pens still stand today. The massive concrete structures proved too difficult to demolish after the war, so they were repurposed, converted into museums, cultural centers, and business spaces. You can visit them, walk through the cavernous bays where U-boats once lurked, run your hands along concrete walls that absorb thousands of tons of high explosives without failing, and if you look carefully, you can find historical markers noting the Allied bombing, Campaign Zing, including the raid on January 3, 1943, when the 303rd Bomb Group lost 4 aircraft and 7 men died aboard a B-17 named Snap, Crackle, Pop. The markers don't usually mention the 8th crew member, the one who fell for miles and lived. But locals know the story. Tour guides share it with visitors, pointing toward the rebuilt train station a few kilometers away, describing the glass roof and the impossible mathematics of survival. Alan McGee's survival teaches us something profound about the narrow margin between existence and oblivion. His fall from 22,000 feet lasted approximately 90 seconds from the moment he left the bomber to the instant he crashed through the glass roof. In those 90 seconds, thousands of variables aligned in his favor, each one improbable. Their combination nearly impossible. If he'd fallen 50 feet to the left or right, he would have hit solid ground and died instantly. If the train station's roof had been flat instead of angled, the glass would have absorbed less energy. If German engineers had built the structure differently, used different materials, positioned the support beams at different intervals, any of these changes would have meant death. Zen consciousness probably saved his life. A conscious person tenses their muscles during a fall, making bones more likely to shatter, organs more likely to rupture. McGee was limp when he hit a ragdoll, whose body could absorb and dissipate impact forces more effectively. The German Dr. Who treated him, that unnamed physician who honored his medical oath despite the hatred of war, resents another thin margin. A different doctor might have prioritized other patients. Might have decided that saving an enemy's mangled arm wasn't worth the effort. That single decision meant McGee kept both arms for the rest of his life. Even his assignment to the ball turret, the result of being short and thin, played a role. Larger men wouldn't have fit in the turret. Wouldn't have been in that particular position when the bomber was hit. Wouldn't have followed the same trajectory through space. In the end, we're left with a question that defies easy answers. Was Alan McGee lucky or unlucky? Unlucky to be a ball turret gunner on a bomber that got shot down over the most heavily defended target in France. Unlucky to lose his parachute in the chaos and fall for miles at terminal velocity. Unlucky to be captured and spend 2 years in a POW camp with life-changing injuries. Reluctant and possibly, miraculously lucky to hit that exact spot on that glass roof. To survive impacts that killed men from heights of 40 or 50 feet, to find a German doctor who cared more about saving lives than following the logic of war, Alan McGee never claimed to have special insight into why he survived. He simply lived his life, worked, married, raised a family, enjoyed retirement. He returned to France once to honor his fallen crew members, planted a tree, and looked up at a glass roof that seemed smaller than physics suggested it should be. On the day Alan McGee fell from the sky, he was one of approximately 8 million men serving in the U.S. military. His survival changed nothing about the strategic course of World War II. The mission failed. Good men died. The war ground on for another 2.5 years. But when you stand in the Saint-Nazaire train station today and look up at those glass panels, you're seeing proof of something that statistical analysis can't capture, that the human body is simultaneously incredibly fragile and astonishingly resilient. That the universe occasionally permits outcomes that seem to violate its own rules, and that sometimes, just sometimes, men can fall for miles from a burning bomber and crash through a glass roof, and wake up to discover that the impossible has become his biographer. Staff Sergeant Alan Eugene McGee fell 22,000 feet without a parachute and survived. The rest of us fell 0 feet and will someday die anyway. Which of us, in the end, has the more remarkable story?